Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a sound that every sailor in the void knows. It is not the deep hum of plasma reactors, nor the rhythmic thrum of the great drives pushing a ship through darkness. It is not the distant clang of a crew going about their duties, the hiss of recycled air through corroded vents, or even the quiet prayers whispered by the navigator in their sealed cupola at the ship's prow. No, the sound every sailor in the void truly knows, the sound they dream about and dread in equal measure, is silence. Not the silence of a peaceful night, not the silence of a ship running quietly through open space under clear stars. The particular silence I am describing is the one that falls like a closing coffin lid when the Geller field generator stutters, when the hum of the protective barrier around the ship drops in pitch, wavers, and for just a heartbeat ceases entirely. In that moment, in that terrible stillness, even the most hardened naval rating holds their breath and waits. And in the warp, in that impossible howling sea of raw psychic energy that lies beneath the skin of reality itself, the things that have been circling the ship for the entire journey, pressing their formless faces against the bubble of protected reality that surrounds the vessel, those things feel the change instantly. They have always been there. They always are. Waiting with a patience that mortals could never comprehend, patient the way only beings unconstrained by linear time can truly be patient. Patient the way a predator is patient when it knows, with absolute certainty, that the wall between it and its meal will eventually develop a crack. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Q, and this is Q on 40,000, your quiet corner of the grimdark galaxy, where we sit together and go deep into the lore of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Today, we are exploring one of the most unsettling questions this setting can ask. Not the wars between armies, not the clash of primarchs, not the grand sweep of 10,000 years of history. Something more intimate than that. Something that happens on a personal scale, in the corridors and engine rooms and prayer halls of ships transiting the Imperium. We are going to talk about what happens when chaos gets inside a ship in the warp. This is a topic that rewards careful exploration, because the answer is so much richer and stranger than you might initially expect. It is not simply a matter of monsters boarding a vessel and killing the crew. The process of warp corruption is layered. It is gradual in some cases and apocalyptically sudden in others. It touches the mind before it touches the body, and it transforms the physical structure of a ship in ways that blur the line between metal and flesh, between a machine and a living thing, between a vessel and something that has its own hungers and its own will. Some of the most haunting lore in all of Warhammer 40,000 comes from these stories. The logs of ships that entered the warp and came back wrong. The testimonies of survivors dragged in front of inquisitors. The silent drifting hulks that emerge from nothing centuries after they were lost. Their holds full of things that should not exist. So, settle in. Let us begin at the beginning, with the warp itself. Because you cannot understand what corruption does to a ship without first understanding what the warp is, and why sailing through it is, at its most fundamental level, an act of breathtaking and necessary madness. Part 1. The Sea Beneath the Sea. Understanding the warp. The warp has many names. Navigators and scholars call it the Imperium, because it is the realm that exists beyond matter, beyond the physical laws that govern stars and planets, and the fragile biological creatures that live on them. Theologians and the devout call it the Empyrean, the Sea of Souls, the realm where the spirits of the dead drift before whatever fate awaits them in that endless dark. Chaos worshippers, and those who have stared too long into its depths, call it the realm of chaos, because in the warp, the four great powers, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, hold dominion over vast, while impossible territories of psychic energy shaped by their nature and their will. Most people simply call it the warp, and most people would be wise to never think about it more than that. The simplest way to understand the warp is to imagine it as a shadow universe that runs parallel to and beneath the physical reality we know. Every galaxy, every star, every planet, every atom of matter that exists in real space casts a kind of reflection into the warp. But this shadow universe is not made of matter. It is made of emotion, of thought, of the accumulated psychic energy generated by every sentient creature that has ever lived or will ever live. Every moment of love and hate, every act of joy and despair, every prayer offered to gods, both false and real, all of it bleeds into the warp and becomes part of its substance, its churning, ever-shifting tides. The result is a dimension of pure psychic energy that has no consistent geography and no stable physics, no reliable sense of time. Centuries can pass in the warp in what feels like hours. Moments in real space can stretch into what feels like years of subjective experience for someone trapped within the Imperium. A ship that enters the warp, traveling in one direction, may emerge from it traveling in a completely different direction, or at a completely different point in time, or not emerge at all. Whereas the tides and currents of the warp are shaped by the emotions of billions of living beings across the galaxy, which means they are in constant churning motion. They roil and surge and calm and rage without warning, without pattern, without mercy. And within those tides, things live. The warp is not empty. It is one of the most densely populated places in the universe, though populated is perhaps not the right word for what fills it. Entities of pure psychic energy drift through the Immaterium, from tiny flickers of hungry impulse that are barely more than stray emotions given rudimentary form, all the way up to vast, ancient things of incomprehensible power, the demons of the chaos gods and the gods themselves. These entities are drawn to living souls the way flame draws moths. The psychic presence of a thinking, feeling mind is to the creatures of the warp what food is to a living body. It sustains them, empowers them, and calls to them across impossible distances. But this creates an obvious problem for anyone who wants to travel through the warp. You see, the thing that makes faster-than-light travel possible in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is also the thing that makes it uniquely terrible. Ships can cross enormous distances in relatively short amounts of time by slipping out of real space and traveling through the warp, riding its currents the way a ship in an ocean rides wind and tide, in stable conditions. A journey between star systems that would take centuries at conventional speeds can be completed in weeks or months of warp transit. This is how the Imperium of man functions. This is how armies are moved across the galaxy, how supplies reach frontier worlds, how communications travel between distant star systems. The warp is the glue that holds civilization together, but every moment a ship spends in the warp, it is surrounded by entities that want to destroy it, devour its crew, and absorb its soul into the endless churning darkness of the Immaterium. And the only thing standing between the crew and that fate is a bubble of protected real space that the ship carries with it, the Geller field. Let us take a moment to think about what life is like aboard a ship in warp transit, before anything goes wrong, because this context matters enormously. The experience of warp travel for a standard crew member is deeply unsettling, even under ideal circumstances. There are no windows on a ship in transit, not useful ones anyway. If you looked out a porthole during a warp journey, you would not see the comfortable darkness of real space, with its distant, reassuring stars. You would see something that defies description. Shifting colors that have no names. Geometries that change as you watch them. Movement in the distance that suggests enormous shapes, vast presences drifting through the Immaterium. Faces pressed against the boundary of the Geller field, visible for just a moment before they dissolve back into the formless energy of the warp. Most crew members learn very quickly not to look at the portholes during transit. The ones who keep looking tend to stop sleeping properly, and then they stop sleeping entirely, and then they start hearing voices. The navigator, that specially bred mutant who alone possesses the genetic gift needed to perceive and chart a path through the warp's impossible geography, sits in their sealed cupola at the prow of the ship. Their third eye, The warp eye that would blind or kill any normal human if it were opened in real space, is open and perceiving the Imperium directly. For the navigator, the warp appears not as the howling chaos it truly is, but as something their mind has translated into navigable information. Some navigators see the warp as a vast ocean of different colored currents. Others perceive it as a forest of light and shadow, as some experience it as sound, an overwhelming symphony of psychic energy that their trained mind can read like a score of music, identifying safe passages and dangerous eddies by the harmonics of the Imperium's song. Far in the distance, always, is the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon powered by the Emperor's will that blazes like a lighthouse from terror, guiding ships home across the darkness. The navigator steers by that light. Without it, they are blind. And the crew below go about their duties. They pray, they maintain the ship, they avoid the portholes. They try not to dream too vividly, because vivid dreams during warp transit sometimes mean something is listening to those dreams from the other side of the Geller field. And they watch the field emitters, those critical pieces of ancient technology bolted into the hull at dozens of points around the ship's structure, with the kind of anxious devotion usually reserved for religious icons, because those emitters are the only reason they are still alive. Part 2. The Geller Field, the last wall between the living and the void. To understand what happens when chaos corrupts a ship in the warp, you must understand with bone-deep clarity what the Geller Field does and what it means. Because without this understanding, the corruption process is just a list of horrible things that happen. With it, you start to feel the weight of the horror in a different way. The Geller Field was invented alongside the warp drive itself during humanity's dark age of technology, that distant, half-mythological period of scientific achievement that the Imperium of the 41st millennium can barely conceive of, let alone replicate. The field device takes an enormous amount of power and generates what is essentially a bubble of real space around the ship. Inside that bubble, the physical laws of the material universe continue to function. Gravity behaves normally, while air remains breathable. Metal stays metal. Flesh stays flesh. The warp's energies are held at bay, pressing against the outside of the bubble, but unable to penetrate it. Think of it as bringing a tiny piece of the real world with you into an ocean of madness. In its most common modern incarnation, the Geller field is generated and sustained by a psyker kept in a permanent, a medicated coma, a living soul whose dreaming mind projects an aura of reality that the field devices around the ship amplify and shape into a coherent barrier. This person, this dreaming psyker, who lies in their sealed chamber somewhere deep in the ship's belly, is quite possibly the most important individual on the vessel. More important than the captain, more important than the navigator. Because if the dreaming psyker wakes, if their concentration breaks, while if the machinery keeping them in that precise state of medicated unconsciousness malfunctions, the field stutters. And when the field stutters, everything changes. The field is not perfectly reliable under the best of circumstances. The Imperium, in its characteristic blend of grim pragmatism and philosophical resignation, has accepted that a certain percentage of its warp traffic simply will not arrive at its destination. Ships disappear in transit with troubling regularity. Some never emerge from the warp at all. Others emerge years or centuries late, their crews dead or transformed beyond recognition. This is considered an acceptable cost of doing business in the grimdark universe of the 41st millennium, because the alternative is not traveling at all, and not traveling at all means the Imperium ceases to function and humanity dies. But there are conditions that make Geller field failure far more likely. Or warp storms, those enormous meteorological events of psychic energy that can isolate entire star systems for decades, subject ships traveling through or near them to pressures that even a fully functional field struggles to resist. The currents in a warp storm are powerful enough to physically shear a ship off course, dragging it into regions of the Imperium where the field emitters are simply overwhelmed by the density of psychic energy pressing against them. Older ships, what with their ancient and poorly maintained field generators, are more vulnerable. Ships whose field generators were built to a subtly flawed specification, and there is at least one famous example of exactly this, which we will discuss shortly, are vulnerable in ways their crews may not even know about until it is too late. And then there is the matter of deliberate interference, because here is the thing that makes warp travel uniquely dangerous in ways that go beyond simple mechanical failure. In the warp, there are things that are very, very interested in getting inside a ship. The entities of the Imperium, the demons of the Chaos Gods, and the lesser creatures that swarm in the currents between the great powers' domains. Experience the psychic warmth of a ship's crew, the way a predator experiences the scent of prey. The living souls aboard a vessel in warp transit are not just potential food. They are a beacon, a signal, a something to focus on in the howling formlessness of the Imperium. Some of these entities are intelligent, profoundly, disturbingly intelligent, and they have had a very long time to learn things about Gellerfield technology, about its weaknesses, about the specific frequencies and harmonics that can be disrupted from the outside to cause a field to flicker. Chaos sorcerers, those mortal worshippers of the ruinous powers who have learned to navigate the politics and patronage networks of the warp, know rituals that can weaken a Geller field on a target ship. There are tales in the lore of ships that entered the warp with their fields functioning perfectly and found those fields mysteriously failing within hours, as though something outside had found the precise resonance needed to begin unraveling them. There is also the simple matter of time. Even a perfectly functional Geller field is not a permanent solution. The longer a ship spends in the warp, the more the field is tested, the more the entities outside press and probe and look for weaknesses, the greater the chance that something, a micrometeorite strike from a piece of debris drifting in the Imperium, a surge in the warp's local psychic weather, a momentary power fluctuation in the ship's reactors, will cause a brief, partial failure. A partial failure is all that is needed. Because once the barrier cracks, even for a moment, the things outside can begin to come through. And once they are inside, the process that follows is not a battle in the conventional sense. It is something stranger, something that operates on levels both physical and spiritual at the same time. Something that the 40k universe describes with a kind of matter-of-fact horror that makes it more unsettling than any amount of melodrama could achieve. The corruption of a ship in the warp begins not with a demon materializing in the engine room. It begins much earlier than that, and much more quietly. It begins with the crew. Part 3. The First Cracks. How corruption begins in the mind. Before any demon steps through a weakening Geller field, before any metal begins to flow like water and reform into shapes that metal should not be able to make, before the ship itself begins to change, the crew begins to change. This is one of the most important things to understand about warp corruption, and one of the most counterintuitive. We tend to think of corruption as something that happens to physical objects, or in the most dramatic cases, as possession, a demon taking over a body. But the lore makes very clear that corruption in the warp operates primarily on the psychic level, on the level of consciousness and emotion and the invisible connections between a sentient mind and the immaterium that surrounds it. Every thinking being has a presence in the warp. Not a large one, for most people. A normal, untrained human soul is barely a whisper in the immaterium's roar, far too small for most warp entities to notice individually. But inside a Geller field, all those tiny presences are collected together, concentrated, are pressed up against the inside of a boundary that separates them from the ocean of psychic energy that wants to consume them. And that concentration matters. It makes the ship's crew, collectively, a much more significant psychic presence than any individual member would be alone. The first sign that something has gone wrong is almost always reported in survivors' testimonies as a change in the quality of their dreams. Dreams aboard a ship in warp transit are already unusual, yet the ambient psychic energy seeping through even a fully functioning Geller field is enough to flavor the sleeping mind's experiences with a vague, persistent wrongness. Most experienced crew members are accustomed to this. They learn to distinguish between ordinary nightmares amplified by warp proximity and the more dangerous kind of dream, the kind where a voice is speaking to you in words that you can almost make out, where something is presenting you with images that are just a little too coherent, a little too specifically tailored to your own particular fears and desires to be random. When the Geller field begins to weaken, even before any physical breach occurs, that distinction starts to dissolve. The dreams become vivid in a way that makes reality feel pale by comparison upon waking. They become personalized in a way that should be impossible, referencing specific memories and private shames that no external thing should be able to access, and they begin to have a cumulative effect on the waking mind. A crew member who has been having these dreams for 3 days starts to feel something that they would struggle to name precisely, a loosening, perhaps. A sense that the world is not quite as solid as they always believed, that the things they were sure of are not quite as certain, that there is, perhaps, another way of interpreting the events of their life, their failures, their resentments, their unfulfilled desires. The voices from the dreams start to follow them into wakefulness, not as audible sound exactly, but as a persistent texture in their thoughts, as if something is providing a continuous, subtle commentary on everything they see and feel. This is what the entities of the warp do. This is how they work. Not through brute force, not initially, but through the patient, incremental erosion of a person's defenses. Chaos corruption is, at its heart, the process of something that is fundamentally alien to human experience, reaching through the boundary of the psychic self and finding the things that are already there: the anger, the fear, the longing, the selfishness, the grief, and gently, persistently amplifying them. Turning the volume up on the aspects of a person's psychology that make them most susceptible to the specific flavor of chaos that is doing the corrupting. Korn's entities look for rage, not dramatic berserker fury, not yet. They start with ordinary irritation, the frustration of a crew member at an officer who treats them unfairly, the resentment built up over years of brutal naval discipline, the quiet, burning anger of someone who has been overlooked and underestimated. These things, fed by warp energy, can grow from a small coal into a wildfire with startling speed. Nurgle's entities look for despair, for hopelessness, for the particular quality of resignation that sets in when someone has been frightened for too long and has run out of the energy to keep fighting the fear. Ships in dire trouble are particularly susceptible to Nurgle's attention. That's because the emotional landscape of a crew facing seemingly inevitable destruction is exactly the kind of fertile ground his corruption requires. The acceptance that comes with giving up, the strange comfort of surrender, these are the entry points. Tzeentch's entities look for curiosity that has curdled into obsession, for the person who has been staring at the warp through the porthole for just a little too long and started to see patterns in the chaos. And for the astropath whose gift of psychic sight has begun to show them things that they cannot stop thinking about. For the navigator who has noticed something in the currents of the Imperium that should not exist according to any chart they have ever seen, and who is spending more and more time in their cupola, not navigating, just looking. Slaaanesh's entities look for sensation. As for the way that warp transit heightens all experiences, the food tastes different aboard a ship in the Imperium, more intense, stranger. The music played by the crew in their off hours takes on qualities it would not have in real space. Colors are slightly more saturated, sounds slightly more resonant. This is not corruption yet, it is just physics. The ambient psychic energy of the warp affects neurotransmitter function in ways that science barely understands. But when those slightly heightened sensations are noticed, when someone starts deliberately seeking them out, starts making choices specifically to maximize that sense of heightened intensity, that is when Slaanesh starts paying attention. Now imagine all of this happening simultaneously to hundreds of crew members who are also becoming increasingly sleep-deprived, increasingly anxious, increasingly suspicious of each other. Because one of the secondary effects of warp corruption spreading through a crew is the breakdown of social trust. As individuals begin to subtly change, as the whispers in their heads begin to align with the specific flavor of corruption touching their particular psychological profile, they begin to treat each other differently. And other crew members, noticing this change, become frightened. And frightened people do what frightened people always do. They look for explanations, assign blame, and then start making decisions driven by suspicion rather than reason. Conflicts break out over things that should be trivial. A disagreement about shift rotations escalates into violence. Someone accuses a bunkmate of theft, and the subsequent confrontation draws in a dozen others who should have had nothing to do with it, each of them arriving already primed for aggression by their own ongoing psychic erosion. The chaplains and confessors aboard attempt to conduct services, but they find that their words are landing strangely, that the prayers that always brought comfort now seem to echo oddly in the ship's halls, as if the architecture itself is subtly wrong, as if the ship is just slightly not the shape it was when the journey began. And here is where we transition from the corruption of the crew to the corruption of the ship itself, because the two are not separate processes. They are the same process operating on different substrates, because in the warp, a ship and the people aboard it are not neatly separate things. They are connected through the psychic resonance of the Imperium, through the fact that every act of fear and violence and worship and despair that takes place within the ship's hull is happening inside the warp, radiating psychic energy directly into the environment, shaping the local conditions of the Imperium in ways that begin to feed back into the ship's physical structure. Yet the warp does not distinguish between the organic and the inorganic the way real space does. In the warp, metal is not just metal. It is matter that exists within a psychic field, generated by the beliefs and emotions and spiritual states of the people in contact with it. Change those beliefs and emotions sufficiently, and you change what the metal is. On some level, that would be difficult to explain with conventional physics, but is entirely real in its consequences. The ship begins to change. And the changes, at first, are so subtle that many crew members simply do not notice them. Part 4. The hull begins to listen. Physical transformation of a corrupted ship. The first physical signs of warp corruption in a ship's structure are typically the kinds of things that maintenance crews attribute to mechanical wear, to the stress of warp travel, to the particular ways that ancient and poorly maintained vessels settle and shift during transit. Small things. And a section of corridor where the lighting is always slightly dimmer than the emitters should produce. A door that no longer opens smoothly, whose frame has imperceptibly warped overnight. A patch of hull plating whose texture feels wrong under the fingers. Not rough, not smooth, but somewhere in between, with a faintly organic quality that the rating running their inspection checklist will write off as corrosion and move on from quickly, not wanting to examine it more closely. The temperature fluctuates in ways that engineering cannot account for. There are cold spots in the ship that seem to move, hot spots around pieces of machinery that are not generating excess heat, as though something is warming the metal from the inside. The recycled air carries smells that have no mechanical explanation, sometimes sweet, sometimes deeply wrong in ways that make the stomach turn, while sometimes carrying the unmistakable scent of things that have no business being present in the sealed environment of a void-sailing vessel. The navigation systems start producing small errors. Not catastrophic ones, not yet, but persistent and inexplicable deviations from the calculated course that the navigator has to keep correcting, as if the ship itself is subtly pulling towards something other than the intended destination, as if the vessel has developed a preference. This is not metaphor, as this is law. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, ships, especially old ships that have made many warp transits and accumulated centuries of psychic residue, develop something called a machine spirit. This is not a programming construct or an artificial intelligence in any conventional sense. It is more like a psychic impression, a kind of personality that accretes in a complex machine when it exists within the warp's influence for long enough. Most machine spirits are benign and are treated with respect and ritual care by the Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests who maintain the Imperium's technology. But a machine spirit in a ship whose Geller field is failing, whose crew is fracturing under psychic assault, whose hull is being soaked in warp energy that aligns with a specific chaos power, that machine spirit can be corrupted just as surely as any human soul. When the machine spirit begins to corrupt, as the ship starts to behave in ways that suggest intent, systems activate and deactivate without command. Blast doors seal themselves at inconvenient moments, or convenient ones, if you are a demon trying to isolate a section of the ship from the rest of the crew. Internal communication systems begin to carry sounds they should not carry. A rating trying to vox the bridge will hear, faint and distant, something that sounds like whispering, in a language that has never been spoken by any human mouth. The automated fire suppression systems in one section will discharge without warning, flooding corridors with retardant foam, while in another section, a fire burns unchallenged because the same system fails to activate at all. The ship is not conscious in any way we would recognize, but it is becoming responsive to something. A something that is reaching into it from outside the increasingly permeable Geller field, learning its structure, exploring its systems, with a curiosity that is entirely alien to the purpose those systems were built to serve. Now the physical transformation begins in earnest. Metal is a surprisingly malleable substance when exposed to warp energy for long enough under the right conditions. And the 40k lore describes corridors where the deck plating has developed a faint texture that was not there before, ridges and patterns that suggest growth rather than machining, as though the metal has started to behave the way a living tissue might. The patterns are not random. They have a fractal quality, repeating at different scales, suggesting an organizing principle that originates somewhere outside the ship's normal physics. In sections of the ship where the crew's collective psychic resonance has aligned strongly with a particular chaos power, the transformation takes on that power's specific character. In a ship being touched by Nurgle's corruption, the metal begins to develop a greenish or yellowish discoloration that spreads like mold. The texture of surfaces changes first in ways that feel like rust or biological growth, and then in ways that are clearly neither. The air in those sections thickens. It carries moisture it should not carry. There is a persistent organic smell, dense and sweet and deeply wrong. Water, or something that functions like water but is darker and has a different smell, begins to seep from joins in the hull plating. In a ship being touched by Tzeentch's corruption, the transformation is more disorienting than viscerally revolting. Walls develop crystalline formations that were not there before, faceted and multicolored, that catch the light in ways that make it impossible to look at a corridor directly. The geometry of the ship's interior seems to change with each transit of the same passage. Crew members report emerging from a familiar corridor in a completely different section of the ship than the one they expected to reach. Sections of the vessel appear to have developed additional dimensions that are not present in any schematic, rooms accessible only from certain angles, as corridors that exist in the ship's apparent interior but cannot be found when you approach from the expected direction. Cornate corruption expresses itself through aggression in the physical structure itself. Metal becomes sharper. Edges that were smooth develop a quality of readiness for damage, not through any visible change in their geometry exactly, but in the way they interact with flesh when touched. The temperature in corrupted sections rises, and the heat is not the comfortable warmth of machinery, but something more feverish. Blood, once spilled in cornate corrupted spaces, does not behave as it should. It pools and moves in patterns that suggest deliberate arrangement rather than the operation of gravity. Skulls that are already present on the ship's decoration. The Imperium uses skull iconography extensively in its architecture and ornamentation, seem more prominent, more real, as though they have been waiting for this environment to become fully themselves. Slaanesh's corruption is perhaps the most insidious in its physical expression because it makes the corrupted spaces feel, initially, better than the uncorrupted ones. Sections touched by Slaanesh's influence are warmer, in a pleasant, rather than feverish way. The light is softer. The air smells of something that is almost perfume, complex and layered and oddly compelling. Surfaces feel good to the touch in ways that are difficult to describe precisely. Crew members find themselves gravitating toward these spaces without fully understanding why, spending more time than is sensible in them, finding excuses to return. It is only when you look carefully at the decoration of those spaces, at the things that have begun to grow from the walls and floors, that you understand what has happened and why the pleasant atmosphere should be the most alarming thing of all. Where throughout all of this, the crew's psychological state and the ship's physical transformation are reinforcing each other in a feedback loop that accelerates as it continues. The ship changes in ways that deepen the crew's psychological corruption. The crew's deepening corruption shapes the warp energy surrounding the ship in ways that drive further physical transformation. Each iteration of this cycle happens faster than the last. And all of this is happening while the Geller field is still, technically functioning, while the demons are still technically outside. When the field finally fails completely, what happens next is in some ways just the culmination of a process that was already well underway. But it is also a qualitative shift of such magnitude that everyone aboard the ship who is still alive and capable of rational thought recognizes it immediately and with certainty. The demons come in. There's Part 5. The field breaks. Demonic incursion. There is a moment that every account of Geller field failure shares. Survivors describe it differently. Some say it felt like a pressure change, like the inside of their heads suddenly equalizing with something vast and outside. Others say it was more like sound, a single note so low it was more felt than heard. And that seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously and lasted for exactly as long as it took to register and understand what was happening. Some describe it as a visual phenomenon, a ripple in the air, as though reality itself briefly became a surface disturbed by impact. What it is, at the physical level, is the moment when the bubble of protected real space finally collapses and the warp rushes in. The Geller field does not simply turn off. In most documented cases of field failure, the collapse happens in stages over seconds or fractions of a second, with the boundary between protected space and the Imperium crumbling from the outside in, from the hull inward. This means that the first things to be exposed to unprotected warp space are the outer hull plating and the void spaces between the inner and outer hulls. Crew members in sections close to the outer hull may experience the transition before those deeper inside the ship. The raw stuff of the warp is not something that can survive contact with material objects for very long without resolving into something more specific. Think of warp energy as being like superheated steam. It interacts with what it touches and transforms in the process. When warp energy contacts the hull of a ship, when it flows through the gaps in the collapsing Geller field and begins to fill the spaces of the ship's interior, it does not simply dissolve the metal or incinerate the crew. When it transforms them, it makes them into something that can exist in both the physical world and the warp simultaneously, which is to say, something that is no longer entirely either. Crew members in the first affected sections experience this as a sudden, overwhelming psychic assault. The voices that were whispers become shouts. The vague sense of dread that has been building throughout the journey becomes something immediate and specific and enormous. And in many cases, as the people whose psychological corruption was most advanced, those who were already most aligned with a specific chaos power, whose machine spirits were already whispering to them, whose dreams had already been comprehensively colonized by something from outside, are the first to change. Demonic possession in a full warp breach is nothing like the slow, subtle process described in accounts of partial corruption. There is nothing gradual about it. A demon that has been pressing against the Geller field for days or weeks, building its focus and its hunger, will enter a suitable host the moment the field fails, in the way that a wave enters a breach in a seawall. Instantly, totally, without the possibility of retreat. The host does not have time to resist. There is no negotiation, no gradual erosion of will. The demon is simply there, occupying the body as completely as water fills a vessel. And the person who occupied that body before
You know, out of everything in 40k lore, this is genuinely one of the concepts that stuck with me the most when I first got into the hobby. Because it's not just evil spaceship does evil things, it's the idea that isolation and fear are the real weapons. The warp doesn't need to tear your ship apart to win. It just needs you to lose faith, to stop trusting the person next to you, to start hearing things in the dark. That slow psychological unraveling before anything even physically changes. That's what I find genuinely unsettling about it. A bolt round can't stop that. A sword can't stop that. It's a horror story dressed up in ceramite and void shield. And honestly, I think that's why I keep coming back to this lore. There's real craft in it. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Is either consumed entirely or forced into a tiny, screaming corner of their own mind, while the demon uses what remains of their flesh. The transformed crew member does not look like a cartoon monster. Not at first. They look like themselves, but wrong. The expression is wrong. The posture is wrong. They move with a fluidity that is slightly too precise, slightly too efficient. As though the biological machinery is being operated by something that learned to use it from diagrams rather than from lived experience. Their eyes are wrong. The color might change or might not, depending on the nature of the possessing entity, but the quality of them is different. They are looking at the world with an interest that is both total and utterly alien. This possessed crew member will, in the first moments after possession, be very calm. This is one of the most unsettling details in survivor accounts. The initial possessed crew members are not immediately violent. They stand quietly in the corridor, or the engine room, or whatever space they occupied when the field failed. And they look at the people around them with that particular quality of focused, detached interest. And the living people around them know, in their gut and in whatever psychic sense humans possess, that usually operates below conscious awareness, that what they are looking at is no longer human. Then more demons come in. The number of entities that can manifest aboard a ship depends on the strength of the local warp environment, the size of the field that has failed, the spiritual state of the crew, and the degree to which any specific chaos power has been building its presence during the transit. In a ship that has been slowly corrupting over a long journey, with a crew whose psychological state has been thoroughly prepared, the number of demons that can manifest when the field finally fails is not 10 or 20 or 50, it is hundreds, sometimes more. They do not all manifest immediately in the same location. They appear throughout the ship, in whatever sections are most hospitable to their particular nature, in the spaces that have already been shaped by their power's influence, during the period of gradual corruption. A ship being claimed by Nurgle will find it's already transformed. A warm and damp and organic-smelling sections suddenly crowded with plague bearers. Those bloated single-horned servants of the Plague Father, each one carrying a tally of the plagues they have spread, moving slowly and deliberately through the corridors as if they have always been there and are simply returning after a brief absence. On a ship being claimed by Khorne, the blood god's brass-skinned bloodletters materialize in the sections where violence has already been occurring. Their black blades already drawn, their focus absolute. They do not seek out leadership or strategy or any kind of systematic conquest. They simply attack everything living that they can reach, and the metal around them begins to sweat blood, and the temperature climbs towards something genuinely dangerous, and the sound of their combat is layered over with something that sounds like drums. On a ship claimed by Tzeentch, the manifestations are stranger, horrors, those cackling, constantly changing creatures that dissolve into further smaller horrors when destroyed, appear in places that should be inaccessible, inside sealed rooms, behind locked blast doors, in the middle of functioning machinery. The geometry of the ship continues its impossible transformation. Corridors now go places they did not go before. Rooms that were mapped and known become unrecognizable. The horror's laughter carries something that works on the hearing like an infection, all making those who hear it uncertain about things they were previously confident of, unsure of their own memories, suddenly finding themselves unable to reconstruct a reliable sequence of recent events. On a ship being claimed by Slaanesh, the demonettes that materialize are terrible in a different way entirely. In the way of something beautiful that is also lethal, that understands desire well enough to exploit it as a weapon. But they move through the newly pleasant-smelling sections of the ship with a grace that is genuinely difficult to look away from, which is precisely the point, and the crew members, who have been spending their time in those sections, drawn back repeatedly by the pleasant atmosphere and the subtle warmth, find themselves caught before they have quite processed the fact that being caught is what has happened to them. In all cases, as the crew that has not yet been killed or possessed faces a choice that is not really a choice at all, because both options lead to terrible outcomes. They can fight, in which case they will likely die quickly, or they can run, in which case they will likely die more slowly and with considerably more suffering. A small number of survivors in documented cases manage a third option, but we will come back to that. Add Part 6. The ship as a living nightmare. Full demonic transformation. The question of what happens to the ship itself, not the crew, the physical structure, after full warp immersion without Geller field protection, is one of the most extraordinary aspects of Warhammer 40,000 lore, and one that rewards extended attention. The short answer is that the ship becomes something else. The longer answer is that this transformation is a process, not an event, and then its end state depends on the specific chaos power involved, the degree to which the ship's machine spirit has already been corrupted, and whether any powerful entities, greater demons, or more rarely the direct attention of a chaos god, have taken a particular interest in the vessel. In the most common and relatively rapid cases, the physical transformation of the hull accelerates enormously once the Geller field is down and the warp is flowing through the ship freely. But the metal of the hull plates, the adamantium of structural members, the ceramite of armored sections, these substances have maintained their material integrity throughout the transit, because the Geller field was keeping the warp's transformative energy at bay. Without that protection, the warp energy now flowing through the ship begins to interact with the material directly, and the results are not random. And they are shaped by the psychic resonance that has been building in the ship throughout the journey. The metal flows, not like water, too slowly for that analogy, but too quickly for it to be the slow distortion of solid-state matter under temperature. It flows like something that has been waiting to flow for a long time and is only now being allowed to do so. Straight structural members develop curves, corners become organic, and flat surfaces begin to develop texture, the specific texture always aligned with the chaos power at work. Bones, eyes, mouths, scales, spines, patterns of decay and growth, crystalline formations and impossible geometries. These are not decorations applied to the surface of the metal. They grow from within it, as if the material has transformed at the molecular level into something that is simultaneously steel and something else. The interior geometry of the ship becomes unreliable in a way that goes beyond the subtle navigation difficulties described earlier. In a fully warp-saturated vessel, sections of the interior that do not correspond to any point on any schematic come into existence. Rooms appear that have always been exactly the right size for the thing they contain, as though they were designed for their purpose from the beginning. As corridors develop spatial properties that physics in real space would have called impossible, a passage that appears to be 20 meters long may take 5 minutes to traverse at a walking pace, as though the distance is being actively generated as one moves through it. The ship's internal sense of direction, always somewhat unreliable during warp transit, becomes entirely meaningless in a fully transformed vessel. The machinery of the ship does not stop working. This is a crucial point. And in many accounts of warp-corrupted ships, the weapons systems remain functional, even as the targeting computers that control them are repurposed by whatever intelligence now occupies the ship's systems, pointing at targets that the original crew would never have selected. The drives continue to push the ship through the warp, though toward what destination only the corrupting influence knows. Life support systems continue to function, maintaining breathable air and tolerable temperatures throughout the ship, not out of any concern for surviving crew members, but because the entities now occupying the ship find that the warmth and air of a biologically hospitable environment suits the maintenance of their manifestations. The ship, in other words, is becoming what the lore calls a demon ship, a void-faring vessel whose mortal crew has been replaced by demons of the warp. Such vessels are often radically changed in appearance. They possess organic, demonic appearances as the real and the unreal merge within the hull. They have a kind of dark sentience, an awareness that is not the machine spirit of an imperial vessel, but something far older and far more malevolent. A warp entity whose size and power has been enhanced enormously by possession of a physical vessel that can move through space and interact with the material universe. The demon ship does not need a navigator, as it can find its way through the warp by means that Imperial scholars have never fully understood, though the most widely accepted theory is that the entity possessing the ship is itself a creature of the warp and has an innate sense of the Imperium's geography, the way a fish has an innate sense of the water it swims through. It cannot leave the warp easily. The prevailing theory is that demon ships can only enter real space by following in the wake of another ship's warp exit, latching onto the tear in reality that any warp jump creates and riding it out. But within the warp, they are terrifyingly capable. They pursue other ships. They have been seen following vessels for weeks through the warp, matching every course correction, never quite close enough for the pursuing ship's weapons to engage them effectively. Navigators who have encountered demon ships in the warp and survived describe them as looking like their original hull forms warped beyond easy recognition, or surrounded by clouds of psychic energy that take the shapes of enormous faces, hands, creatures from the deepest nightmares of the warp's collective unconscious. And in their holds, in those transformed corridors, and those rooms that should not exist, other things begin to accumulate. Other ships that have been less fortunate than the one the demon ship was hunting. Debris from vessels consumed and absorbed. Over centuries, as multiple ships confuse together into enormous conglomerations of corrupted hull metal and impossible architecture, still drifting through space and through the warp. Their cargo a mixture of ancient technology and horrors that have been accumulating for longer than most Imperial records can account for. This is how space hulks are born. Part 7. The 4 Flavors of Damnation. Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, Tern, and Slaanesh. We have touched on the different ways each of the 4 Chaos Gods expresses their particular corruption through a ship, but this topic deserves more thorough treatment because the differences are significant and the lore around each is rich and specific. Every Chaos God represents a fundamental aspect of consciousness and emotion taken to an extreme, made real and powerful by the psychic weight of countless beings who have felt those things across the history of the galaxy. They are not simply different flavors of evil. They are genuinely distinct principles, each with its own aesthetic, its own logic, its own particular way of reaching into a person or a ship or a world and making it theirs. Khorne, the blood god, the Lord of Skulls. Khorne the Conqueror. His realm in the warp is built from the residue of every act of violence ever committed, from the merest petty cruelty all the way up to the apocalyptic slaughter of entire civilizations. He is often mischaracterized as simply a god of mindless savagery. This is not quite accurate. Khorne values martial prowess genuinely. He demands that killing be earned through skill and courage, rather than achieved through trickery or sorcery, which is why he and Tzeentch, the master of deception and magic, are such implacable enemies. But his demand for blood transcends any concern for which blood is being spilled. His own followers kill each other just as readily as they kill their enemies. And this is considered acceptable as long as the slaughter continues. A ship falling to Khorne begins its transformation with the crew, the specific psychology that Khorne's corruption exploits. The anger, the competitive aggression, the desire to prove oneself through combat is present in almost any military crew to some degree, and this makes Khornate corruption surprisingly common among ships of the Imperial Navy. The initial signs are accelerating disciplinary problems, and fights that start over minor issues and escalate to lethal violence faster than they should. An atmosphere of testosterone-charged aggression that pervades every compartment. officers finding that their authority is challenged openly in ways that the same ratings would never have dared before the journey began. As the physical transformation progresses, the ship's weapon systems become the focal point for the hull's structural changes. Where Nurgle's corruption might cause organic growth and decay, where Tzeentch's might generate impossible geometries, Khorne's corruption sharpens things. Every edge becomes more acute. Every weapon mounting is enhanced, its barrels and firing mechanisms becoming more elaborate, more capable, more brutal. The skulls that decorate so much Imperial military architecture, placed there to remind the faithful of mortality and the price of failure, become more prominent, more real, more numerous, and because the ship's metal has been reforming to add them, working toward an aesthetic ideal that Khorne's demonic energy is imposing on the hull's substance. The blood is everywhere. Khornate corruption is wet in a way that is not at all like Nurgle's dampness. The moisture in a Khorne-claimed ship is hot and coppery, and it comes from the violence being perpetrated within and from the hull itself, which has begun to weep what is unambiguously blood from its seams and joints. Yet the blood letters that manifest when the field falls find a ship whose entire environment has been prepared for them, a temple to their god's principles, built from the material of what was once an Imperial warship. Nurgle, the Plague Father, the Lord of Decay, Grandfather Nurgle. He is the strangest of the four Chaos gods because he is, in certain crucial ways, the most benevolent. This sounds paradoxical for a god of pestilence and death, but it makes a kind of twisted sense when you understand his actual philosophy. Nurgle's insight, if that word can be applied to an entity made of disease and rot, is that life and death are the same cycle, that decay is not the absence of life, but a form of it, and that the fear of death is the greatest source of suffering in the universe. His offer to his worshippers is this: I will take your fear of death from you. I will make you part of the cycle rather than subject to it. Yet you will never be truly well, but you will also never truly die. This offer is particularly compelling to people who are already dying. Ships whose crews are facing catastrophic failure, oxygen running out, reactor meltdown inevitable, structural damage too severe to repair, are natural candidates for Nurgle's attention. The lore tells us explicitly that many dying crews have called out to Nurgle in their extremity, asking for his intercession, on offering their service in exchange for the continuation of the ship's existence. The Lord of Decay is generally willing to make this trade. The Nurgle-corrupted ship is one of the most viscerally disturbing objects in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. It is alive. Not in the metaphorical sense of the demon ship's dark sentience, but biologically alive, in the way that a body is alive. Warm, wet, organic, constantly growing and dying and growing again. Thus, the hull plating develops what can only be described as a skin, complete with pores and follicles. The structural members breathe, visibly contracting and expanding at irregular intervals. The corridors are full of biological material, fungal growth, insect colonies, nests of things that are not quite insects, layers of material that was once metal and is now something in between. The air is breathable but deeply unpleasant, thick with organic compounds and the spores of Nurgle's particular diseases. Plague bearers move through the corridors tending to the ship's biological components with the focused attention of skilled nurses. They are, in a sense, physicians to the great sick organism that the ship has become, because a Nurgle-corrupted ship is always sick, always in the process of some disease or another, but also always healing, always finding new expressions of life in the spaces that disease has opened up. Or the Terminus Est, Typhus's flagship, which we will discuss at length shortly, is perhaps the definitive example of what this looks like, taken to its ultimate conclusion over 10,000 years. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, the great conspirator. His is the most intellectually disorienting corruption, because it does not simply degrade its subjects, but transforms them in ways that may, from certain angles, look like improvement. Tzeentch is the chaos god of change for change's sake. of manipulation, of hidden knowledge, of the web of schemes that extends backwards and forwards through time in ways that no mortal mind can fully comprehend. His followers believe, with various degrees of accuracy, that they understand his plans. They do not. The plans fold back on themselves, contain outcomes that seem to contradict each other, pursue goals that make no sense until the moment they make devastating sense. And Tzench does not merely manipulate events. He manipulates the people who are manipulating events, and then manipulates those who are manipulating them, and so on through a chain of nested deceits that eventually loops back around to its own beginning. A ship falling to Tzench becomes impossible in the most literal sense. The physical laws governing its structure begin to bend. Its geometry changes and changes and changes again, never settling into a stable configuration, as if the ship is constantly in the process of becoming rather than simply being. Survivors of Tzechian corruption describe navigating their own vessel as a philosophical exercise in epistemology. Nothing they were certain about yesterday is reliable today, and the things that are certain today will be wrong tomorrow. The only constant is change, and even that constant changes. The horrors that manifest are among the most purely unsettling creatures in the entire demonic menagerie. But because they are not threatening in the way that a bloodletter is threatening, a bloodletter will kill you, and this is terrible but comprehensible. A pink horror might also kill you, or might transform you into something else, or might simply cackle at you and change its own form 3 times while you are trying to decide what to do about it. And in the meantime, the corridor around you has rearranged itself, and you are no longer sure where you are or where you were trying to go. But the blue horrors that emerge when a pink horror is destroyed are sullen and resentful rather than manically energetic, and they spread a cold, numbing despair that is different from the warmth of Nurgle's acceptance but equally effective at neutralizing resistance. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, the Dark Prince, the Lord of Excess, the youngest and in many ways the most complex of the 4 Chaos Gods, born from the collective hedonism and sensation-seeking of the ancient Eldari Empire, whose fall created the Eye of Terror when the psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth tore a hole in reality large enough to swallow several star systems. Slaanesh is the god of all sensation taken to extremes, of all desire pursued without restraint, of all pleasure sought without regard for the harm it causes. This covers everything from the most obviously debauched forms of excess to the more subtle obsessions. The artist who cannot stop working even as it destroys their body. The soldier who has developed an addiction to the specific experience of combat. The navigator who keeps opening their third eye, not to navigate, but because the sensation is incomparable. The Slaanesh corrupted ship is the most dangerous kind in some ways, precisely because it is the least immediately horrifying. You do not recoil from it the way you recoil from a Nurgle ship's biological excess. You are drawn in. But the spaces where Slaanesh's influence has taken hold are genuinely pleasant in ways that your body responds to before your conscious mind can evaluate. The corruption is the pleasant feeling. The damnation is in the pursuit of it. The demonettes that manifest are terrifyingly efficient predators who have been using desire as a weapon for longer than the Imperium of man has existed. They understand what each individual wants and what each individual fears with a precision that feels personal, because it is. The warp's knowledge of each soul is intimate in ways that should be impossible. When the field fails on a Slaanesh corrupted ship, the crew that has already been drawn into the pleasant spaces find themselves unable to leave even as those spaces fill with things that will destroy them, because the want is stronger than the fear. Part 8. Case Study in Damnation. The Death Guard Fleet and the Terminus Est. Everything discussed so far becomes viscerally real when we look at specific historical examples from the lore, and there is no better example of warp corruption on a fleet-wide scale than the story of the Death Guard's journey to Terra during the Horus Heresy, and the ship that emerged from that horror as something entirely new. But the Death Guard were the 14th Legion of Space Marines, the sons of the Primarch Mortarion, who had grown up on a death world called Barbarus, and developed a philosophical rejection of weakness that had served him well as a warrior, but left certain psychological doors in his mind slightly ajar for exactly the right kind of corruption to slip through. Mortarian's legion was known for their endurance, their refusal to yield, even their ability to operate in toxic and hostile environments that would kill other space marines. They were grim and methodical and extraordinarily resilient. They were also, beneath all of that resilience, terrified of the warp. This matters. The specific psychology of the Death Guard, their pride in their ability to endure anything, their discomfort with things they could not overcome through sheer physical and mental fortitude, though their complicated relationship with disease and physical suffering was precisely the psychological profile that Nurgle had been waiting patiently for. The scheme that brought the Death Guard fleet to its doom was initiated by a man who called himself Typhon. As the first captain of the Death Guard, and the keeper of a secret that would have damned him had his Primarch known it, that he was a chaos sorcerer of considerable ability who had been secretly committed to the service of Nurgle for years before the Horus heresy began. When the Death Guard fleet embarked for Terra as part of Horus's forces, Typhon executed a plan that was as elegant as it was monstrous. He framed the fleet's navigators as agents of the enemy. Then he had them executed, removing the one class of individual who could safely guide the fleet through the warp. He then assured Mortarion that he could guide them to Terra without navigators, using a group of psychically gifted legionaries as substitutes. Instead, he led the fleet into a trap, deliberately becalming them deep in the warp, adrift in the Imperium, with no ability to find their way out and no navigators to restore their course. Being becalmed in the warp is one of the most dread fates that can befall a fleet. The ships do not stop moving. The warp currents carry them aimlessly in whatever direction happens to be dominant at any given moment. But they have no ability to direct that movement toward any destination, and the longer they drift, the more the warp's influence accumulates within their hulls. The Death Guard were becalmed for what felt subjectively like an eternity, though accounts differ on how long it actually lasted in real terms. Long enough that the despair began. A disease appeared. The lore calls it the Destroyer Plague, and it was unlike any disease that even the Death Guard's famously resilient physiology had encountered before. It spread from ship to ship through the fleet, not through conventional vectors, not through contaminated air or contact with infected crew members, but through the warp itself. He carried in the psychic medium of the Imperium that now flowed freely through the increasingly compromised hulls of the fleet's vessels. The Space Marines, those superhuman warriors whose bodies had been engineered to resist almost any physical assault, found that their enhanced immune systems and accelerated healing and ability to synthesize antitoxins from almost any pathogen they had previously encountered all failed completely against this particular affliction. The Destroyer Plague was not attacking them the way an ordinary disease attacks a body. It was attacking them as warp entities attack, through the psychic connection between body and soul, through the gap between what they were and what they were capable of being, filling that gap with something that was specifically designed to be irresistible to their particular nature. And it worked. Death Guard warriors who had survived environments that would kill any other living thing lay helpless in their armor, unable to die, because the disease kept them alive, barely, in a state of perpetual agony, unable to recover, unable to do anything except suffer in the becalmed fleet's corrupted corridors. Mortarion, brought finally to his limits by watching his entire legion suffer without any means of ending that suffering, did what Typhon had been engineering him toward all along. He called out to the Chaos Gods for relief, and Nurgle answered. What happened next was total. The Destroyer Plague did not kill the Death Guard. It transformed them. The agony they had been enduring became not less painful, but somehow different in its quality. Pain that was also a kind of comfort, suffering that was also a kind of strength, the paradoxical serenity of something that no longer fears the thing that was killing it because it has already been claimed by it. Their bodies changed, bloating and rotting and regenerating, their power armor fusing with their flesh, in ways that should have been fatal, but were instead just another expression of what they were becoming. They were reborn as plague marines, the first of Nurgle's corrupted space marine servants, still wearing the colors of the 14th Legion, but now also wearing the gifts of the Plague Father in every line of their swollen, diseased, virtually indestructible frames. The ships changed with them, and every vessel in the fleet that had been drifting in the becalmed warp was claimed simultaneously with the Legion within it. The hulls transformed along the lines we have described: biological, damp, organic, warm in the wrong way, the air inside changing to the dense, spore-laden atmosphere that the newly made Plague Marines found not just tolerable, but comfortable. The machine spirits of those ancient vessels were subsumed into something older and more patient. But of all the ships in that fleet, one ship underwent a transformation so thorough and so specifically Nurglite in its character that it became legendary. The Terminus Est, flagship of Typhon, who had now fully become Typhus, herald of Nurgle, host of the Destroyer Hive, was the ship on which the decisive moment of the fleet's corruption had taken place. Mortarion had confronted Typhon on its bridge. The final transformation of the Death Guard had played out in its corridors. The ship had been a witness to the most significant single act of demonic corruption in the Horus Heresy, outside of the events on Terra itself. Over the 10,000 years that followed, the Terminus Est became what it is today. Something that those who see it and survive describe not as a warship, but as a piece of Nurgle's realm, given permission to travel the stars. For its true dimensions are impossible to determine because it is surrounded by vast clouds of demon flies, the same warp-spawned insects that first transformed Typhus into the host of the Destroyer Hive. These flies serve as a living defensive screen, obscuring the ship's profile and destroying any projectile or energy weapon that tries to penetrate to the hull. The hull itself is a poisonous mixture of dissolved heavy metals and biological material, its surfaces covered in boils and blisters and fractures through which the ship's internal atmosphere seeps outward. The interior of the Terminus Est is Nurgle's garden in miniature. Soupy pus drips from overhead in the corridors like warm rain. The things that shuffle through that miasma and tend to the ship's biological systems are barely recognizable as the human beings or space marines they once were. The Death Guard Plague Marines who serve aboard it are unaffected by the ship's environment, which is to say, they are entirely in their element. Typhus himself sits on the command throne and barely moves during transit, his mind fused with the ship's dark sentience in a communion that is as close to prayer as someone like Typhus ever gets. The Terminus Est does not need a crew in the conventional sense. It does not need maintenance schedules or engineering checks or the 1,000 small interventions that keep a normal ship functioning. It heals itself, or rather, it continuously dies and is reborn, decaying and regenerating, the corruption that would kill any other vessel simply being another expression of its nature. It is, in the most literal sense, alive with Nurgle's blessing. It is one of the oldest ships in the known galaxy that is still actively sailing, its age being measured in thousands rather than hundreds of years, held together not by engineering, but by the will of its patron god. This is what a ship looks like when Nurgle claims it completely and keeps it for 10 millennia. It is extraordinary and terrible in equal measure, and it is the most thoroughly documented example of a demon ship in the entire lore. Part 9. Space Hulks, the Graveyard of the Warp. We have been talking about individual ships corrupted by chaos, but there is a natural extension of this process that creates something even larger, even more complex, and in its own way, even more haunting. Space Hulks are the graveyard ships of the 40,000 universe, and they arise directly from the processes we have been discussing. A Space Hulk begins as a single lost ship. Sometimes this ship was corrupted by chaos during a warp transit and consumed by the Imperium, and sometimes it simply suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure that left it drifting without power in the warp, its crew dead or transformed, its hull gradually being colonized by the energies of the Imperium. Sometimes it was deliberately sent into the warp, without proper protection by someone who wished it never to be seen again. Whatever its origin, a lost ship in the warp does not maintain its original form indefinitely. The warp's transformative energies work on it continuously. Yes, and over years and decades and centuries, the hull changes. It grows, not always in ways that increase its size, but in ways that increase its complexity. New internal spaces come into existence that were not part of the original design, following the logic of whatever warp currents have been dominant in the region during the ship's drift. The machine spirit of the ship, if it was not already consumed by daemonic possession, may persist in a kind of half-life, maintaining systems that no longer have any crew to use them, following maintenance protocols designed for a ship that no longer quite corresponds to the physical reality of what it has become. As the lost ship drifts through the warp's currents, it encounters other lost ships. The warp does not provide convenient separation between its inhabitants, the way real space does. Objects in the Imperium tend to be drawn together by psychic resonance, and two hulks drifting in the same region will eventually contact each other. When they do, the contact is not a collision in the conventional sense. The warp energies that saturate both hulks begin to merge at the point of contact, and the two separate vessels begin to fuse, not mechanically, but at the level of their warp-altered material composition. Their hulls grow together the way wounds heal, slowly, producing a join that is stronger than either original material, and which incorporates features of both. This process continues as more ships are added. Over centuries, what began as 2 or 3 separate vessels becomes something vastly larger. A conglomeration of vessels from different periods, different cultures, different purposes, are fused together into an enormous and entirely incoherent structure that has its own internal atmosphere and gravity, because the sheer mass of warp-altered material has developed those properties through processes that conventional physics would struggle to account for. The navigation systems in a space hulk do not correspond to any standard schematic. The interior geometry is shaped by the accumulated warp corruptions of every vessel that contributed to its formation, or which means a space hulk might contain sections that reflect the aesthetic of Horn, sitting adjacent to sections with clear Nurgle influence, with impossible Tzeentchian geometry connecting them in ways that have no logical basis in the original vessel's designs. Moving through a space hulk is a navigational challenge even for the most experienced Space Marine Terminators, who are the troops the Imperium deploys for this specific purpose, not because the corridors are especially narrow, but because the geometry does not behave consistently. The hulks exit and re-enter the warp seemingly at random, pulled by currents that cannot be predicted by any known means, driven by whatever vestige of drive capability remains in one or more of the component vessels, or simply carried by the Immaterium's tides to wherever those tides are flowing. When a space hulk exits the warp and appears in real space, it is often near inhabited systems. Well, because inhabited systems generate significant psychic presence in the warp, and the hulks, saturated with warp energy, are drawn to that presence. The Imperium treats the appearance of a space hulk as a potential threat requiring immediate response. They are catalogued, surveilled, and in many cases boarded by Terminators of the Adeptus Astartes, whose mission is to clear out whatever currently inhabits the hulk and recover any valuable technology that the centuries of amalgamation might have produced. Because here is the other side of the space hulk story. They are also, in a very real sense, treasure houses. The vessels that make up a space hulk may include ships from the dark age of technology, before even the Imperium's oldest records. They may contain technology that has been lost to the mainstream of Imperial knowledge for millennia. They may include fragments of equipment, weapons, navigational charts, genetic material, and knowledge that the Adeptus Mechanicus would pay essentially any price to recover. The possibility of this is why boarding a space hulk is considered worth the enormous risk it entails. The famous sin of damnation, boarded by the Blood Angels in one of the most celebrated examples of this kind of operation in 40k canon, was a space hulk that had accumulated across centuries of warp drift. When the Blood Angels' first company boarded it, they found it infested with genestealers, those alien parasites that use space hulks as a means of interstellar travel, hibernating in the dead spaces until the hulk drops out of the warp near a suitable inhabited world. The Blood Angels cleared several thousand Genestealers from the hulk in a battle conducted almost entirely in the cramped corridors and transformed spaces of a vessel that had been drifting through the warp for longer than anyone could precisely calculate. The Fury is another notable example. A space hulk that began not as a ship, but as an actual planet that the Adeptus Mechanicus had attempted to outfit with drives and a warp core as a vast mobile facility, and only for it to be lost in the warp and gradually transformed into something that no longer resembled a planet at all. When the Viridian Consul's Space Marine chapter settled on it during the Abyssal Crusade, they were corrupted by its warp-tainted environment and became the heretic warband known as the Broken, claiming the Fury as their mobile fortress and using it to raid Imperial space. There is a saying, sometimes attributed to various sources in the lore but possibly apocryphal, that summarizes the Space Hulk's nature perfectly. It contains the dead past and the living nightmare in equal measure, and you cannot have one without the other. Part 10. Those Who Survive. Faith, Resistance, and the Aftermath. We have spent a great deal of time exploring the horror of warp corruption in ships, and it would leave an incomplete picture if we did not also address the question of resistance. The 40,000 universe is not a place where hope is entirely absent. It is present. But it is hard-won, fragile, and always provisional. And in the context of warp corruption on ships, there are documented examples of crews and individuals who fought the corruption and, in some cases, survived it. The primary mechanism by which Imperial crews resist warp corruption is faith. This sounds like a simple and perhaps unsophisticated answer, but the lore treats it with more nuance than that. Faith in the 40,000 universe. It is not merely a psychological state that makes people feel better. It is a genuine psychic phenomenon with measurable effects in the warp. The collective belief of a ship's crew in the Emperor of mankind, in his protection, in the rightness of their service. This belief generates a psychic resonance that partially counteracts the warp energies trying to penetrate the ship's defenses. The ecclesiarchy, the religious institution that maintains the imperial cult, then has developed extensive protocols for maintaining crew morale and faith during warp transit, specifically because the practical benefits of a praying crew are well understood, even if they are not well understood at a technical level. Chaplains aboard warships conduct multiple services daily during warp transit. Confessors hear the crew's admissions of fear and doubt and shame and process them into something that can be offered up to the Emperor, rather than left to fester in the psychic medium of the immaterium. The physical act of prayer, conducted collectively by hundreds or thousands of people in a ship's chapel, or in sections of the hull marked as sacred space, it creates a counter-resonance that the entities pressing against the Geller field must overcome before they can begin the psychological erosion process. This is not a perfect defense. Faith can be eroded the same way everything else can be eroded. But it is a genuine one, and the lore is full of examples of ships that survived warp transits that should have killed them because their crews maintained their faith and their discipline when both should have collapsed. The strength of the Geller field, as far as anyone in the lore can determine, is not solely a function of the technical maintenance of the field generators. It is also a function of the psychic state of the crew inside it, the collective spiritual health of those who are relying on it for their survival. A crew of devout, disciplined, well-led people generates a stronger bubble of protected real space than the same crew under different circumstances, regardless of the technical specifications of the equipment. Officers who understand this, and the best captains in the Imperial Navy very much do understand it, manage their crews during warp transit with this specifically in mind. Disciplinary problems are dealt with quickly and firmly, not merely for the sake of order, but because the psychic residue of unresolved conflicts is exactly the kind of material that warp entities feed on. Work rotas are structured to keep crew members occupied and purpose-driven, It's because idle minds in the warp develop the kind of introspective spiral that creates access points for corruption. The chaplains are given broad authority to intervene in any situation they judge to be spiritually dangerous, superseding even operational command when necessary. But when a demonic incursion does occur despite all of this, when the Geller field does fail and entities do manifest aboard the ship, the response that gives the crew the best chance of survival is coordinated counterattack with religiously consecrated weapons, combined with the immediate activation of every remaining psychic and spiritual defense available. Certain types of weapons and armor are held in reserve aboard Imperial warships specifically for this scenario. Yet the specific rites of exorcism that Ministorum priests can perform are effective at banishing manifested demons, though they require proximity to the possessed or manifested entity and exact a significant spiritual cost from the priest performing them. Space Marine chapters respond to warp incursion aboard their ships with a quality of organized, faith-driven violence that is particularly effective against warp entities, partly because of their physical capabilities, and partly because the psychic resonance of a Space Marine's absolute certainty in the Emperor's protection creates exactly the kind of counterforce that the entities of the warp find most uncomfortable. The Astartes do not feel fear the way ordinary humans do, not because they are incapable of it, but because they are trained and psychically conditioned to process it differently. Or their certainty of purpose in the face of warp horror is itself a weapon. Recovery from warp corruption, if the ship survives the immediate crisis, is a lengthy and imperfect process. The Inquisition, specifically the Ordo Malleus, whose remit covers demonic threats, maintains protocols for assessing and decontaminating ships that have been compromised. In practice, these protocols often amount to determining how much of the ship and crew can be salvaged versus how much must be destroyed to prevent further spread of corruption. The Inquisition's willingness to condemn entire ships and all their surviving crew to death in order to ensure that no trace of warp taint escapes into the wider Imperium is well documented and entirely characteristic of that institution's particular philosophical approach to the problem of chaos. Most physical decontamination of warp-corrupted hull material is something the Adeptus Mechanicus theoretically knows how to perform, but in practice, deeply corrupted sections of hull may need to be cut away entirely and replaced, and the spiritual decontamination, the process of reversing or counteracting the psychic transformation that the warp energies have induced in the material, is even more difficult, as sections of ships that have been fully claimed by warp corruption have been known to resist conventional cutting tools, as though the material has acquired properties that standard ceramic and metal cutting simply cannot overcome. The tech priests of the Mechanicus approach these situations with extensive ritual preparation and considerable anxiety. The crew that survives a warp corruption event will spend the rest of their lives carrying what they experienced. Yet, the Inquisition's standard protocol is to subject all survivors to extensive interrogation, followed by either execution if the degree of taint is deemed too high, or psychic cleansing procedures that vary in their invasiveness and their effectiveness. Many survivors of significant warp events are subsequently found to have developed minor but persistent psychic sensitivities, not full psycho abilities, but a heightened awareness of the warp's presence, a tendency to experience predictive dreams, a sensitivity to the presence of demonic entities that makes them simultaneously valuable to Inquisitors as consultants and dangerous because their heightened connection to the warp makes them potentially susceptible to future corruption. The psychological damage, regardless of what psychic effects they may carry, is profound and permanent. What a person experiences when warp entities are inside their ship with them, when their shipmates are being possessed and transformed in front of them, when the walls of the vessel they trusted to carry them safely through the void are growing eyes and mouths. This is not something that can be processed through any treatment the 41st Millennium can offer. The survivors who speak of these events do not speak of them in terms of recovery. They speak of them in terms of survival, continuing to function, of finding ways to carry the knowledge of what exists in the darkness and what it is capable of without being paralyzed by that knowledge. This is perhaps the most human thing about the entire subject. In a universe where the ships themselves can become monsters, where the void holds enemies that operate on every level simultaneously: physical, psychological, spiritual. The people who face those enemies and keep going anyway, and who maintain their faith and their discipline and their humanity in conditions designed to strip all three away, are performing something genuinely remarkable. Something that the grim dark of the 40k universe cannot quite contain in its grim framing, because it insists on being something like heroism, even here. Part 11. The Darkness Between Stars. What this all means for the 40,000 galaxy. Standing back from all of this and considering it as a whole, what does the phenomenon of warp corruption in ships tell us about the larger 40,000 universe? Because it tells us a great deal. And what it tells us is, in its own terrible way, one of the most coherent and thoughtful aspects of this setting. The corruption process we have described is not random. It is not simply the universe doing terrible things to people because the setting demands grimness. It is a system, a comprehensible and internally consistent system with clear mechanics and causes and effects. Ships are corrupted by the warp because the warp is what it is, a dimension composed of consciousness and emotion, populated by entities that feed on living souls, traversed by vessels that are essentially containers of exactly the kind of material those entities want most. The question is not why some ships get corrupted, but how any ship manages not to get corrupted. The answer to that question reveals what the Imperium of man is actually built on. It is built on faith, not faith as a comfortable belief held in pleasant circumstances, but faith as the specific psychic response to the most genuine, existential threat that sentient life has ever faced. The Emperor, whose psychic presence powers the Astronomicon and guides every navigator who sails in the warp, is not merely a figurehead or an ideological symbol. He is the specific entity whose nature, expressed through the belief of billions of his subjects, creates the counterforce that makes warp travel survivable. The prayers offered in a ship's chapel during transit are not theatre. They are the mechanism by which the crew maintains their Geller field at the psychological level. They are, quite literally, what keeps the darkness out. This creates a universe in which the distinction between the religious and the pragmatic completely collapses. The priests are also soldiers. What the prayers are also weapons. The faith is also technology, in the sense that it performs a function without which the Imperium could not operate. And the corruption of that faith, the slow erosion of certainty and hope and purpose that warp entities pursue in a ship's crew, is not just a spiritual threat, but an operational one, because a crew that loses its faith loses its ability to maintain the barrier that keeps its ship intact. There is something deeply honest about this, but in the way that good science fiction is honest about the things it is really talking about. Warp corruption in ships is, at its most fundamental, a story about what happens to communities under sustained existential pressure. About the way that fear and isolation and the breakdown of trust create vulnerabilities that enemies, real or metaphysical, can exploit. About the importance of meaning and purpose and shared belief to the maintenance of a functional, coherent community. About what it costs to maintain your humanity in conditions designed to strip it away. The Warhammer 40,000 universe uses the spectacular, grim-dark language of demons and possessed ships and 10,000-year-old plague frigates to talk about things that are deeply human. And the ships that sail the warp, those fragile bubbles of protected real space, carrying their terrified crews through an ocean of madness and hunger, are perhaps the most vivid expression of this that the setting offers. They are everything the Imperium of man is: old, compromised, held together by belief as much as by engineering, surrounded by things that want to consume them, still somehow sailing, still somehow arriving. In the endless darkness of the far future, this is what survival looks like. Not safety, not comfort, not victory in any final or conclusive sense, just the continuation of the journey, the maintenance of the flame against a darkness that is always, always pressing in. And somewhere in the warp, around a ship that has been sailing for 10,000 years under the sign of Grandfather Nurgle, the flies keep buzzing, the pus keeps dripping. The crew that cannot quite die shuffles through corridors that were once proud Imperial steel and are now something that defies clean description. And Typhus, the traveler, sits on his throne and communes with his ship, which is also his god's blessing and also his prison, which is also the most perfect expression of what warp corruption ultimately produces. Not destruction, but transformation. Not ending, but continuation in a form that something else has chosen. Whether that is worse than the alternative depends entirely on who you ask. And that question is, in the end, one that the living and the warp claimed alike are still working through. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you made it this far, then you already know how deep this lore goes and how much the Warhammer 40,000 universe rewards careful attention. The warp and its relationship with ships and crews is one of those topics that just keeps revealing new layers the longer you look at it. And I hope today's exploration gave you some new angles to appreciate it from. If this video helped you understand the lore better, or if you just enjoyed the journey through the grimdark, please take a moment to hit the like button. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who love this universe as much as we do. And if you have not already subscribed to QON 40,000, now is a great time. We cover all aspects of Warhammer 40,000 lore in this same slow, thoughtful, story-first style, and there is always more darkness to explore. Until next time, the Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.